All right, imagine this. You're in the heart of Australia, the late 1930s, and farmers are just about getting ready to enjoy the fruits of their hard labor after planting vast stretches of wheat. But then, out of nowhere, comes a feathery horde on a mission. No, it's not a scene from a bird apocalypse movie. It's the actual start of what's going down in history as the Emu War. Yes, you heard it right. A war against emus. Those big, flightless birds that seem like they wouldn't hurt a fly. Well, turns out they can certainly wreak havoc on crops. Following the World War I, many soldiers returned home and were given land for farming in Western Australia, a move by the government to settle its warriors. Fast forward to the onset of the Great Depression, and these farmers were now facing rock-bottom wheat prices, making their struggle for survival even harder. If that wasn't enough, nature decided to throw in a curveball. Approximately 20,000 emus, fresh from their breeding season, saw the beautifully cleared and cultivated lands as an ideal habitat. They swooped in, not to attack the farmers, but to decimate their crops, and so began an invasion that no one could have predicted. As the birds started their unexpected assault, tearing through the wheat fields like a feathery hurricane, leaving destruction in their wake, it became clear that this was no ordinary pest problem. This was a full-blown invasion. The emus, emboldened by the cleared lands and abundant resources, began to take over, showing the settlers that despite their peaceful appearance, they could become formidable adversaries in the fight for survival. Little did anyone know, this was just the beginning of an epic saga that would pit man against bird in a story that's as bizarre as it is true. And so, the stage was set for what would be one of the most unusual chapters in military history. Okay, picture this. You're a farmer, right? You've put in all the hard graft to till your land, you've sown your crops, and just when you're about to reap the rewards, boom, in waltz about 20,000 emus, turning your golden fields into their personal snack bar and dance floor. That's the nightmare scenario the farmers in Western Australia found themselves in. After World War I, these blokes were given land as a thank you for their service. Times were tough, the Great Depression hit, and on top of that, the government was like, hey, plant more wheat, will ya? Promising them help that never came. So, there they were, with all their hopes pinned on this crop to pull them through, and the emus decide it's buffet time. But it wasn't just about the emus having a munch. Oh no, these birds, big as they are, started tearing through fences, leaving gaps wide enough for rabbits to hop through and cause even more havoc. The double whammy of emus and rabbits was like a 1-2 punch to the gut for these folks. So, what do you do when you're facing an army of feathery invaders, seemingly hell-bent on destroying your livelihood? You call for backup, and that's exactly what these farmers did. They reached out to the government, basically sending an SOS that they were under siege by the bird brigade. And not just any backup. They were asking for the military to come in with machine guns. I mean, how bad does it have to get for you to say, you know what this farm needs? A couple of Lewis guns and some soldiers? The farmers' plight was genuine despair wrapped in absurdity. They were stuck between a rock and a hard place, trying to fend off bankruptcy and birds. The government's initial promise to support the wheat prices fell flat, and now their only hope was that machine guns could save their crops from the Great Emu onslaught. It was like a bizarre twist of fate. Soldiers turning from fighting in the trenches to battling birds in the fields, all in the hope of protecting the wheat that was meant to symbolize their new start post-war. Talk about jumping out of the frying pan and into the fire, right? So, the emus have launched their invasion, and the farmers are at their wits' end. What do you do when giant birds start eating up your livelihood? Call in the army, of course. It sounds like the setup to a bad joke, but folks, it actually happened. Faced with the feathery onslaught, the Aussie government decided it was time for some military intervention. Enter stage left, the Royal Australian Artillery, armed to the teeth with Lewis guns and 10,000 rounds of ammunition. The plan? Get rid of the emus, save the crops. Simple, right? Well, not exactly. Sending the military to deal with a bunch of birds might seem like using a sledgehammer to crack a nut, but these were desperate times. The Minister of Defense, Sir George Pearce, thought so too and agreed to the farmers' plea. Under the conditions that the Western Australian government would foot the bill for the transportation and the farmers would provide food, accommodation, and pay for the ammo, the military set out to wage war against emus. You heard that right? Soldiers versus birds. They even brought a cameraman from Fox Movietone to capture this bizarre chapter of history, possibly to show off how the government was helping. or perhaps just in case they turned the tide against the feathered insurgents. What follows could only be described as the most Australian thing ever, a battle against nature, where nature absolutely refuses to play by the rules. The troops, under the command of Major Meredith, arrived with high hopes and heavy firepower. But they were about to find out that emus were not just oversized turkeys, they were fast, surprisingly strategic, and seemingly bullet-resistant. The government's plan to quickly resolve the emu issue and look like heroes was about to hit a snag bigger than a kangaroo in the headlights. But as we'll see, this was just the opening act of a saga so ridiculous, it could only be true. So, armed with optimism and machine guns, the military set out to tackle the emu situation head-on, expecting quick victory. But, let me tell you, those birds had different plans. Picture this. A few soldiers with big guns against 20,000 emus. Sounds like a mismatch in favor of the humans, right? Wrong. The emus were not going to just stand there and take it. From day one, things didn't quite go as planned. The first attempt to curb the emu population was, frankly, a bit of a mess. The soldiers spotted 50 emus and thought, this is it, easy game. But as they tried to get close, the emus splintered into smaller groups, practically laughing in the face of military tactics. Even when the soldiers managed to get a shot off, the emus were so surprisingly fast and evasive that most shots missed. And when they did hit, well, let's just say emus are tougher than they look. The emus' initial evasion was just a taste of the comedic yet frustrating battle that was to unfold. You might think that's funny enough, but wait until you hear about the ambush near a local dam. Over 1,000 emus were spotted, and this time the military thought they had them cornered. But as soon as they opened fire, the gun jammed after just 12 birds were hit, and the Great Emu escape began. The remaining emus scattered, with not a single one more added to the tally of that day. The military's first attempts were not just unsuccessful, they were embarrassingly ineffective against the surprisingly nimble emus. The birds, seemingly equipped with their own version of military strategy, utilized guerrilla tactics, proving to be formidable opponents. The soldiers, skilled in combat against humans, were left scratching their heads as emus proved that being flightless birds didn't make them any less adept at dodging bullets. It was clear that this war wasn't going to be won with firepower alone. Alright, so after the first round of the operation wrapped up with, let's say, less than stellar success, the military decided they hadn't had enough of our feathery foes. The emus were still having a field day with the crops, and the farmers were about ready to hang up their hats. Something had to be done, and fast. So back to the drawing board they went, and what came next? You guessed it. Round 2 of what can only be described as one of the most bizarre chapters in military history. With the backing of the Premier of Western Australia and a war chest of fresh ammunition, the military strategized for a more effective second attempt. They weren't just going to wing it this time. Major Meredith, the man of the hour from round 1, was called back into action. Now, imagine this. It's early November, right? The heat is beating down, the dust is swirling, and here come our soldiers, trudging back into the fray, armed to the teeth and ready to take on some birds. But this isn't your ordinary hunt. Oh no, this is warfare, emu style. This time, they had a plan. With refined tactics, including better ambush coordinations and aiming for more strategic locations where emus congregated, the military hoped for a turn in their favor. And for a while, things looked promising. In the first few days, they managed to hit their targets more accurately, reportedly taking down about 40 emus by the end of the second day. But let's be real. When you're waging war against a bird that can run up to 31 miles per hour, unpredictability is part of the game. By mid-November, they were clocking about 100 emu casualties per week. It wasn't the sweeping victory they might have dreamed of, but it was something. Stay tuned, because the saga of emu versus man is far from over, and it's just as wild as it sounds. Alright, get this. After the first few attempts at controlling the emu population turned into an all-out flop, you'd think we'd step back, right? Wrong. We turned the dial up to 11 with what I like to call unconventional warfare. Picture this, a military operation against birds. Yes, birds. The Australian military, armed to the teeth, squaring off against these big, feathery beasts who seemed to have the tactical prowess of seasoned guerrilla warriors. So what made this whole thing really stand out was the almost comical lengths we went to try and gain the upper hand. The emus weren't just birds, they were master strategists, evading bullets, disappearing into the landscape, and somehow always staying one step ahead. And the military's response? They decided to mount machine guns on trucks, a move you'd think would give them the edge. But no, the emus outran the trucks, and when they couldn't, the bumpy ride made aiming so difficult that hardly a feather was ruffled. This whole episode feels like it should have been a scene straight out of a Looney Tunes cartoon, not real life. And yet, here we were, launching a full-on military operation against birds. Birds that just wouldn't give up. As it turns out, emus are tough, really tough. The more we chased, the more they scattered, turning our efforts into a wild goose chase, except with emus. It's like they held a war council, decided on guerrilla tactics, and left us humans scratching our heads, wondering why our modern warfare techniques were being outsmarted by flightless birds. So, yeah, unconventional warfare took on a whole new meaning during the Great Emu War. It's a story that's equal parts hilarious and bewildering, reminding us all that sometimes nature has a way of putting us in our place, and maybe, just maybe, teaching us a lesson in humility. So, after all the chaos, the dust settled, and the soldiers packed up their gear, there was a moment of baffled reflection. Here they were, battle-hardened veterans, licking their wounds after taking on birds. Yes, birds. The whole scenario sounds like a script ripped straight from a comedy sketch, doesn't it? The emus, those feathery adversaries, seemingly had the last laugh as the soldiers withdrew, leaving the farmers to face the birds' relentless appetites. It was a moment that surely had some scratching their heads. How did a mission with machine guns end up being outmaneuvered by birds? Major Meredith's sentiment that if the army had a division with the resilience and evasiveness of these emus, they could take on the world, resonates with almost a grudging respect for these feathered foes. It's fascinating to think about, comparing emus to military tanks or to the Zulus, known for their fierce combat tactics. There's something both humorous and admirable about the emus' unanticipated combat skills. The withdrawal wasn't just a moment of defeat. It was a profound lesson in humility and the unpredictability of nature. The tale of the Emu War serves as a reminder that sometimes, no matter how sophisticated our strategies or technologies may be, nature has its way of putting us in our place. It wasn't just about the failure to manage wildlife pest. It was a story that highlighted humans' often underestimation of nature's ingenuity and resilience. The war against the emus puts into perspective the challenges of environmental management and the complexities involved when humans and wildlife collide. Who would have thought emus could teach us so much about nature, warfare, and maybe a bit about ourselves? So, after all that gunpowder settled and the military trucks rumbled back to base, you'd think that would be the end of the emu saga, right? Wrong. Those emus, seemingly unfazed by the efforts of the Aussie soldiers, continued their march across the farmlands. It's almost like they won the battle, moving with a bit of extra swagger in their step. Despite the military's best efforts, including nearly 1,000 confirmed emu casualties, the birds' impact on the agricultural scene persisted. The farmers were back to square one, facing the feathery foes with no machine guns in sight. What's funny, or maybe a bit ironic, is how this entire episode played out in the bigger picture. The emus, blissfully unaware of the chaos they'd caused, continued their usual business of snacking on crops and wandering through the farmlands, leaving a trail of frustrated farmers and bemused onlookers in their wake. The Great Emu War might not have achieved its original goal, but it did show the resilience and adaptability of these birds. They were, in a sense, the ultimate survivors, thriving against odds that included armed soldiers and military strategies. Fast forward a bit, and the legacy of the emu's impact is still visible, not just in the damaged crops, but in the approach to managing them. Fencing, bounties, and more humane methods of control became the norm, steering away from the militaristic approach that, let's face it, didn't really pan out as planned. It's a testament to the idea that maybe, just maybe, understanding and adapting to nature's ways is a better strategy than trying to dominate it. So, while the emus might have been the unintentional villains in the eyes of the farmers, they ended up teaching a valuable lesson in coexistence and the unpredictable nature of wildlife management. The Great Emu War, though a bizarre blip in the annals of military history, has carved out a unique cultural legacy that continues to amuse and bewilder people around the globe. Let's face it, the image of a military force, complete with machine guns, going head-to-head with a flock of birds, is something straight out of a slapstick comedy. Yet, it's this very absurdity that has cemented the Emu War's place in popular culture. From being the punchline of countless memes on the internet to inspiring episodes in podcasts dedicated to history's oddities, the story of man versus emu has become a tale for the ages. Perhaps one of the most telling signs of its cultural impact is how the Emu War has been adopted into the world of arts and entertainment. Musical adaptations, plays, and even proposed action comedy films are in the works, aiming to capture the hilariously futile effort of humankind's attempt to control nature and failing spectacularly. These creative endeavors not only highlight the story's entertainment value, but also underscore the universal appeal of underdog, or underbird, in this case, stories. The emus, unwittingly, have become symbols of resilience in the face of humans' often misguided attempts at dominance. On a deeper level, the Emu War serves as a cautionary tale about the unpredictable challenges of managing the natural world. It reminds us of the importance of understanding the environment we inhabit and the creatures we share it with. As we continue to laugh at the folly of the Great Emu War, let's not forget the lessons it offers for future human-animal encounters. After all, sometimes history's most ridiculous stories are the ones that have the most to teach us. And so, the tale of the Great Emu War ends, not with a bang, but with the soft rustling of feathers in history. This quirky episode, straight out of an Aussie farmer's fever dream, speaks volumes about the unpredictability of nature and the futility of underestimating it. It's a story that resonates because, let's face it, who doesn't love an underbird story? In the grand scheme, the emu's victory over the Australian military highlights the resilience of the natural world in the face of human intervention, a kind of David versus Goliath, if David were a 6-foot-tall bird with a penchant for agriculture destruction. But why does this story matter? Beyond the chuckles and the head-shaking disbelief, the Great Emu War serves as a metaphor for human ingenuity, meeting its match in the form of nature's unpredictability. It's a reminder that for all our technological advancements and strategic prowess, there are still challenges that we can't simply shoot our way out of. This episode teaches us to approach problems with humility and respect for the natural world, seeking solutions that harmonize with, rather than dominate, our environment. Moreover, the cultural legacy of the emu's triumph, from musicals to films, shows us how stories of resistance and resilience can capture our imagination and inspire creativity across generations. It's a narrative thread that connects us to the past, even as it entertains and enlightens. So, the next time you see an emu, maybe give it a nod of respect. After all, those birds are part of a lineage that once outmaneuvered the Australian army. And in that acknowledgement, there's a sense of connection to the grand, often absurd, narrative of history, one where feathers sometimes outdo firearms.